Well, in the series of How We Got Our Bible, session 2, transmission of the text. And I was saying to Derek before we began, the picture on our screen is of a scriptorium. It's a little later than the scribal tradition that we'll be exploring this evening. It is from the medieval era. There would be the abbot standing at the front. He would be reading from a master text, and the monks sitting and listening would write down what he is reading out. And that is how multiple copies were made from the heart of the monasteries through the medieval church. Well, our aim, or some of the things that we'll be doing for this session, is to consider what is involved with the human act of creating, copying, and preserving texts. So from the beginning of the fundamentals to then how it looks and the results of that effort we'll be exploring. And the second thing that we'll be dabbling in is to appreciate the scribal efforts. What went into being a scribe? What efforts went into writing down these texts? What went into keeping these texts and passing them on? And then, if we understand that, then when we get to dealing with the copies of the texts that we have, how can we be confident what we're working with? There's a word there, text critical. We're going to look at that more next session, but ultimately that is just how do we analyze the various manuscripts that we have. But the intricacy of that is for next time. For now, we're appreciating the bedrock of the work of the scribes that textual critical work functions from. So the first major question we have for this evening is, why write a book? If you have a message to tell, if you have a message to pass on, why bother writing a book? Why not just do it orally? It's been done for many centuries in the past. Oral tradition, word of mouth. Is writing a book superior? Well, another way to put it is, why commit something to writing? And some of the reasons we sort of dabbled with last week. We communicate clearly. We write, hopefully, what we mean to say. With speaking, it's prone to error, mishearing. With written communication, those things are still possibilities. I might miswrite something, because we'll explore next week it's happened. There might still be misunderstanding, but those chances are lessened when something is committed to writing. But not only does it communicate something more clearly, it preserves information. That if I am a speaker and I am a fount of knowledge for one subject, and I go around teaching everybody, and everybody's expected to hear and remember what I say, well, when I die, how much information is being lost because it wasn't remembered, wasn't recorded? With writing, if I write down my thoughts, write down the information that I know, then there is a higher level of material that is being preserved and then passed on, hopefully. Again, we explored this element last time. It guards better against corruption. I use the illustration of Chinese whispers when you play at a party. You have one sentence, and then it goes through 10 children's mouths, and then you wonder, where on earth did this final sentence come from? It bears no resemblance to what was initially said. Well, when something's written down, it guards against that. Because if I have an error on this document, well, I can look at the original document. Or if I have a document here and here that say something, well, what's the commonalities? How can I analyze the two? And what's the chances of me then finding the original wording? And that is what textual criticism is, that we're going to look at in more detail next week. And then finally, it disseminates information accurately, which I think I've combined into clearly in my explanation. So we'll pass on. So let's start with the fundamentals. What is needed if I want to write a book? Well, I need certain materials. I need basic equipment. I need a marking instrument. Today we might say I need a pen, but it wasn't always a pen, was it? It was various other tools that make marks on a material. I need some material to mark. The most common medium today is paper, but it was not always paper. Perhaps more fundamental than that, I need something to write, some symbols that will communicate information that other people can then decipher and know what I'm trying to say by these squiggles on a page. So I need an alphabet, I need a language. And then I need an author or a scribe. I need someone who can actually understand the alphabet, the language, and write down the information. Well, let's start with alphabet. Basic symbols were used to communicate since at least the 4th century BC. That's not century, it's millennia. I'm getting confused in my head now. A long time ago. 4th century BC would be 400s BC, wouldn't it? That's not correct. 4000 BC. And I proofread this today. How these early symbols worked was that they would work on a word or syllable level. That is, you would have one symbol resembling one word or syllable. The problem with that is it's quite limited. You have to have a lot of symbols to then sort of put the pieces and puzzles together to communicate everything that you might want to say. And so a more fuller way of communicating was symbols functioning on the level of sound or vocalization, which is what we use in our modern alphabet. So early alphabets that we have here, we have a Mesopotamian cuneiform on your left, and perhaps more familiar to our eyes would be the picture on the right, which is Egyptian hieroglyphs. So these, especially the hieroglyphs, would work on that syllable level. One symbol would work as one syllable typically. And so if I wanted to spell the word bark, I might have one symbol denoting that syllable of ba, and then I'd have another symbol that would be that sound uk. And I'd put ba and uk together. Two symbols makes that one word bark. An example of one symbol being one word, you might have a picture of an eye, and that communicates either your bodily eye or perhaps the function and capability of being able to see. Now, how do you interpret those different words when they might refer to one and different things? Bark could be referring to bark on a tree, or a dog barking. And you'd have helper words. So perhaps in the Egyptian hieroglyph, if you wanted to talk about the bark of a dog, you would have your two symbols saying the word you want, and then you'd have a helper word, which might be a picture of a dog. Or if you wanted to communicate the tree, you'd have the same symbol, bark, and you'd have a picture of a tree. So there was all different ways of communicating on these symbol levels. Just a matter of interest. You can read either way on the hieroglyphs with Egyptian writing. But when you you can write either way. But when you come to read it, the way that you have to read is the way that all the characters and animals are facing. They're all facing the same direction. And so you would read on that particular one from right to left. I just thought that was interesting. Now, the first alphabet proper that we have evidence for in a museum is this one found in Syria, 2300 BC. That is a picture of a jar or a pot, and obviously the writing has been highlighted for you to make out clearly. They are definitely squiggles, and that is telling you the contents of the jar. Other early evidence of alphabets were found in Sinai. That was dated to around 1700 BC, and then another one in Egypt, 1800 BC. There's some of the earliest evidences of proper alphabets. That is moving beyond those symbol level ways of communicating, like the hieroglyphs, to more of a alphabet that we would be familiar with today. So if we just delve a little deeper and more specific to our Western alphabet, we have here a stone with some writing on called TT99 Ostracon. And it is an early Semitic Proto-Canaanite alphabet dated around 1800 BC. This narrows it down to our sphere of alphabets because there were two alphabetic systems that were taking place. There was one called Halaham. We're not interested in that one. We're interested in a system called Abgad. A-B-G-A-D, Abgad. It's named because of the first letters in that alphabet. And all of our more Western-orientated alphabets derive from the Abgad system. So the Greek alphabet, Alpha, Beta, Gamma. The Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel. It's A-B-G, Abgad. And so that is an ancestor of the biblical languages and our own, as it also influenced Latin, and we're influenced by Latin to a large degree, I would say. Other languages it influenced was Hebrew, Aramean, Phoenician, Greek, and Latin. What's written on the actual stone is thought to be itself an abecedary to help people learn the alphabet. Well, why have we gone into such depth about alphabets? It's to say this, that well before the time revelation was committed to writing by the hand of Moses and its subsequent writers, God had established a way for written information to be communicated. In God's providence, He gave us alphabets and languages, and they were well in place so that we might have, from Moses' time, the revelation of God written in the 5 books, and of course then language develops and develops and develops, and we have the rest of the Bible. So that's the languages. What about material? How many ways of writing something on some material with something can you think of?
You could crush up bark or insect shells and make a paint.
Okay, so yeah?
Like a cave painting or something.
Yeah, so in your illustration you've got some sort of paint, some colour, and a wall. Yeah, brilliant. I've not actually got that one. Chris, go ahead.
Use chalk or charcoal.
Yeah, again, some sort of colour. Yeah, fine. Well, you've got those. The first one I've got is a chisel and a stone. They're sort of the ones we see early on in our Bibles, as we see in the Ten Commandments. They were written on 2 tablets of stone. We have in Job an allusion to a scribe on a stone. I think there's a reference in Jeremiah as well. The problem with a chisel and a stone is, depending on how big a rock you can get, the limited space, And certainly if you wanted to write a lot of information, they'd be heavy to transport. But the plus side is they're well preserved. They weather well. You have wet clay and pottery. That was the Mesopotamian example that you saw. That was written on clay and pottery, and you'd have a little, it's not a pen, there is a word for it, but it's escaped my mind. A stylus, yes. And you would make marks in the wet clay, and then you would bake it or let it dry, and it would preserve it as a record. Again, probably limited space. I don't know if you've seen them in any museums, but they don't waste any space. You can have a cube, and every single face has got writing on it, and where you start and where you go, beyond me, but limited space. Storage, difficult. You need to have a large library to keep them in if you're going to have many of them. And of course, they were breakable. Once you bake clay, they can smash and chip, and you can lose information that way. So moving on, we have, I guess, ink, some sort of colour and dye, and then you can either be writing that on papyrus, which is made from a plant, or parchment, which is made from animal skin. The problem with that is they are organic matter, and organic matter likes to decompose after a while, so preservation becomes a problem. But on the plus side, they're a lot lighter. You can make as bigger one as you like. Papyrus tends to be quite brittle after a while, but it solves the problem of the other two, really. And then you get an improvement with a scroll. Well, that's easy to transport. You have it wrapped up nicely. You can put it in a jar. You can file it better. It takes up less space because it's not spread out flat. It's condensed. But the greatest invention that really influences how, especially the Christians, dealt with their literature was the codex. That's a fancy word for a book. In a book, you have abundant space. It's compact. It's comparatively easy to transport. And so the book really revolutionized how information was stored, written and passed on.
Oh, do you know when codexes kind of came about?
Yes, we'll get to it.
Oh,
How about a phone? Yeah, the apostle didn't have a Samsung. Okay, so we have an alphabet. We have some materials to be writing with and to be written on. And now we get to the role of the scribe, and that is the picture in the background is an Egyptian hieroglyph of that activity taking place, a scribe at a writing desk. So scribes. It was an important historical craft that took many years from childhood to acquire. And it was hard graft. You need to be studious, disciplined, thoughtful. And it would primarily involve the skills of writing, memorizing, and reciting. So, if you wanted to become a scribe in your childhood, you would begin to learn the alphabet, whatever that was for yourself. Once you've mastered the alphabet, you would begin to learn vocabulary. You would start amassing words, and then you would memorize those vocabulary lists. And when you've got a basic grasp of words that enables you to deal with large swaths of information, you would begin to learn important works. You would memorize and recite treatises, legal contracts. And then you would take to writing yourself. You would memorize and adapt proverbial sayings of the day. And then if you wanted to master being a scribe, well then at the end of that progression, you would be expected to memorize and recite major works. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's 25,000 words. And if you was to read at 300 words per minute, you would be talking for 4 hours and 36 minutes. And so we get to our Old Testament scribes. There was a class of scribes within the Old Testament people, but perhaps one of the more important unofficial scribes was the king himself. In Deuteronomy 17:18, we have the command here that when the king takes the throne of his kingdom, he himself was to take on the duties of a scribe, as it were, and he was to write his own copy of the Torah, the law, that he might then live from it. But perhaps more traditional scribes we encounter are Sariah in 2 Samuel 8:17. We have in 1 Kings two people called Elihareph and Ahijah. They were the sons of Shisha, and they were described as this role called secretaries, which would be the same role as a scribe, just under a different name. And then perhaps the cream of the crop was Ezra, the scribe.
Were they all men?
I don't know. Please turn your Bibles to Deuteronomy 31. Here we have the link between sacred texts and where they're stored. So once a scribe has written a document, there is a link between keeping that, if it's a religious text, within a religious setting. Now this is going to be important in another subject further down the line, but just for the sake of seeing it here. Deuteronomy 31:24. When Moses had finished writing the words of this law in a book to the very end, Moses commanded the Levites who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, "Take this book of the law and put it by the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against you." So there we have those fundamental documents of the law, and they were placed in the sacred box of the ark because they were sacred texts, and they were to be dealt with reverently and with respect. And we see that taken on again with the temple. If we turn to 2 Kings chapter 22 verse 8, it's a famous passage of scripture as it is the finding the book of the law. And if the law is a sacred text, where do you think you might find it? Well, that's where Hilkiah, under the reign of Josiah, they're doing works in the temple, maybe having a clear out, a reshuffle, and they stumble upon what? The book of the law, because it is a sacred text. And so the Old Testament scribes were functioning in a religious context where they were writing sacred texts, preserving sacred texts, and those texts were fundamentally kept in sacred places, and the temple itself being the pinnacle, as it is sort of a library for the Jewish texts. Well, what is the importance of the scribe? This was written in a Jewish text, and it's a rabbi talking to another rabbi. When I subsequently came to Rabbi Ishmael, the latter said to me, "My son, what is your vocation?" I told him I am a scribe. And he said to me, "Be meticulous in your vocation, because your vocation is a task of heaven. Should you by chance omit or add one letter, you would thereby destroy all the universe." The stakes are high. And we see this because the removal of one letter changes everything. We might say God is faithful. Transliterated version of the Hebrew would be emeth. If we drop our E and you say meth, you say God is dead. The scribes had a noble and high task. You imagine the weight upon your shoulders of preserving and copying the Word of God, knowing that a mistake like that could get you in a lot of trouble. Oh, what do we encounter when we get to the New Testament scribes? Well, turn to in your Bibles to Romans 16, and we'll meet one of them. A simple verse, really. It says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. I remember when I first twigged and kind of, what? Paul didn't write Romans. Of course, Tertius is his scribe. He is writing down what Paul dictates to him. And so here we see the scribe Tertius writing this letter. And he would have been a scribe. He would have been trained to the standards that he might do so adequately and with precision. And so what we see is the New Testament scribes carried on that careful and that reverent and precise standard that their predecessors had founded. Well, when we get to the notion of copies and letters and writing down previous information, we get to the big subject of textual transmission. What does it look like? And it's not the picture. On the picture we have a copy machine, and we can appreciate our printers, that when I printed off my notes, I can be assured that you all have the same text in front of you without any error. That our copying machines are so accurate, so precise, so dependable. Maybe not dependable in terms of when they break down, but when they function, they work, don't they? I don't have to sift through every copy. Well, now has Farhad got the same copy as Roger? Well, I wonder if. But old copying wasn't like that. It was done by hand. It was done by candlelight. It was done by tired, weary people who are fallible, who make mistakes. And so we need to bear that in mind. But if we are saying that there are mistakes in copyists' works, which of course there were, we have another big question. Well, when it comes to our biblical documents, were they faithfully copied and preserved so that we might have confidence that we have the correct words in our Bibles? That's a big question indeed, and that's one that we're going to really delve into again, as I say, next week. But what ground might we be able to stand on to answer that question initially with a confident yes? Well, to get there, we have another question. Were early Christians able to copy their texts? Were those very first Christians in the first century and then early second century, were they competent? Did they have the ability to take the apostles' texts and writings and copy them in a way that they are faithfully passed on? And then were they systems and ways in place to keep those texts and preserve them? Well, I have a picture of the disciples in their boat there. They're fishermen. And that sets the context for one of the answers that we get to that question, because some say no. And they paint a picture of, well, all these early Christians were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. They were uneducated. They were untrained. They didn't have any formal training in scribal transmission. So how could they have passed on a faithful message? Well, to push against that answer, we can say this. Proportionally, Christianity had the same demographic of a normal Roman society. Now, normal Roman society, 10 to 15% were literate, and therefore we can say fairly confidently that the same figure is probably true for the Christian communities that existed in that empire. And we might actually, if we're bold enough, want to say most likely that it was more than that. Because Christians, following the pattern of the Judaism and the Jews before them, they grew up and were immersed in a textual world. That the Jews, at the heart of their faith, was our Old Testament, the Scriptures. And when the Christians came along, they too had that Old Testament and Scriptures. And now they're having more texts presented to them. And they would go to the synagogue every Saturday. The Christians would go to their churches and meet. And what were they doing? They were gathering round a text that was read to them, that was shown to them perhaps. And so perhaps more than most normal average Joes in the Roman society, Christians were more literate because they were immersed in a world of reverence to texts. They were being publicly taught and hearing the public reading of the word. They were attending catechisms where they would be taught from Scripture. And then finally, we might just point to our New Testament documents anyway. They alone are evidence that that hypothesis of an illiterate, uneducated people is not true. That we have the Gospel of John, for example, written by a fisherman. And yes, it is simple Greek compared to reading Luke or another work like Hebrews. But nevertheless, it's not simplistic. It's not all over the place. There's a coherent message. There's thought through ideas and structuring to that gospel. And so then we get to what one commentator calls a bookish people. Because the Christians were at the forefront of this writing technology called a codex. That, yes, the century prior it was coming in, but it never really took off until the Christians adopted it as their means of transmitting and keeping information. And so it was the Christian communities that took this idea of a book, and yes, let's use it for God's glory. And so Christians relied on codices earlier than any other group at the time. A single codex was able to contain all four Gospels, or the Pauline epistles. And so they were brilliant at what the Christians wanted them to do. And so the evidence points to the fact that most scribes, even early on, were very good at what they did. We have large quantities of manuscripts, and from that quantity we see there exists a quality even from our earliest manuscript evidence. which leads us to examine some of them. On the screen there you have a picture of a manuscript labelled P75. It was written from roughly 175 AD to 225 AD. On it there are parts of Luke's Gospel and John's Gospel, and this manuscript was really important in our understanding of the scribes, because it was the catalyst for correcting the misconception that early copyists were predominantly unskilled. That was the consensus in scholarship before P75 was found. It is early, and it is written with a precision and neatness that really pushes against this idea that, well, the early scribes really was just hashing it together. They didn't really know what they were doing. So P75 pushed against that wrong view. But not all manuscripts were that neat and that tidy. And we get P72. That is dated 200 to 250 AD. That contains portions of Jude, 1 Peter and 2 Peter. But what P72 shows us is that just because it looks a bit rough, just because it's a bit scribbly in places, bad style doesn't mean bad copyist. That the information there is still legible and it is still in general consensus with other manuscripts that we have. That just because it's written roughly doesn't mean the information is wrong. Let's turn to Colossians 4. Verse 16. And when this letter has been read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and see that you also read the letter from Laodicea. Again, just a little, perhaps even off comment to most of our reading in our devotions, but actually that tells us a lot about how copying and transmitting of texts functioned even at the very beginning when these New Testament documents were being written. We have the idea of there being our author, Paul. Now, he writes his letter to Colossae, and they receive Paul's letter. Now, that diagram isn't quite right, because what happened traditionally is that would be a copy in itself, that Paul would have two letters the same. He would keep one as a foil and send the other off. So Paul would have a copy when he sent one off, and then the church would receive one copy, and then you would have copying take place in that church, and then you would send it off somewhere else, and from that copy you would have further copies that were sent out, and you see how it multiplies and is sent further and further abroad. There is evidence of our earliest text. It's called P52. It is dated from 110 to 150 AD. It is a section of John chapter 18, verse 31 to 33. Scholarship typically dates the writing of John around 90 AD, which means, a conservative estimate means that copy there is 30 to 40 years after the original was written. So it might be a first copy from the original. And this discovery also challenged prevailing assumptions about the early transmission of Christian texts. And it helped to dispel the notion that early Christianity was merely oral in their tradition. So a popular hypothesis was that Christians didn't write down their texts very early on. They transmitted it by word of mouth. And as I've said from the very beginning, that oral tradition allows for more error to creep in. And so the saying goes, well, Christians passed on their message by word of mouth, so by the time that it's written, we can't know that that's really what was said, because we just don't know. It could be that Chinese whispers effect, that by the time the Christians have gotten to writing their stuff down, well, who knows what transformations taken place in the passing on through word of mouth. But this text P52 dispels that, because here we have evidence of a early written document. So, what can we say in light of all this? We can say this, that the copying tradition and textual evidence is to be counted trustworthy, that the scribes were dedicated, well-trained, they were good at what they did, and that manuscripts were written early, they were done to a level of proficiency that we can have confidence in. And one author says this: the earliest copyists of Christian literature were trained professional scribes. And so we can have confidence in their work. And that then lays the bedrock for what we do with the mass of manuscripts that we have. Because we can work from the foundation that the scribes were good at what they were doing. We can trust what they've done, rather than from a sort of an approach of superstition. Well, these texts, how do we even know that they're trustworthy in themselves, let alone then dealing with various differences and discrepancies? But no, we have this ground to stand on, that the scribes were good at what they did, and therefore when we get to dealing with differences, we can be a little bit more sympathetic. So as we sort of look ahead to what we are going to explore next week, there are two things that a textual critic looks for. Two things that get them really excited. And that is early manuscripts and lots of manuscripts. And in both of these categories, the Bible stands head and shoulders above everything else. Among ancient literary works, the Bible is unique in its early witnesses, like P52. Something like that is unheard of for any other ancient literature. To have a copy of a text so close to its origin, it's unique. Now, early manuscripts without quantity of manuscripts might not be that convincing for people, but the Bible doesn't disappoint in that area either. The Bible is unique in the sheer quantity of copies that we have. We have a plethora of texts that dwarfs any other ancient literary work. And so we have a good base to stand on. We can be confident, and we should be assured that the foundation set for understanding how we got our Bibles is set and it is firm, as we then look next time to what we do when we do discover differences. What is the nature of these differences? How do we look beyond those differences and establish a text with confidence that we can say, yes, this was the original wording. There is a methodology and there is a science behind this that means, yes, we can do that.